For nearly 200 years, the Teutonic Knights ruled Eastern Europe with an iron fist. Their white surcoats emblazoned with black crosses struck terror into the hearts of their enemies. They were crusaders, warriors, and empire builders. They seemed invincible. They seemed eternal. But on July 15, 1410, in a place called Grunwald, everything changed. A Polish-Lithuanian alliance deployed a shocking tactic that would shatter the myth of Teutonic invincibility and end their dominance forever. This is the story of how the masters of war met their match. If you love untold stories of history's greatest battles, subscribe now and hit the notification bell. Comment below which medieval power you think was the most fearsome. Now, let's begin. The Teutonic Order was not merely a military force. It was a state, a theocratic empire that ruled over Prussia, controlling vast territories in Eastern Europe. Its power was absolute. Its wealth was immense. Its military reputation was legendary. For nearly 2 centuries, no one had successfully challenged Teutonic dominance. The order began as a crusading military organization in the late 12th century. Founded initially to fight in the Holy Land, the Teutonic Knights eventually redirected their efforts toward the Baltic. They established themselves in Prussia around 1230, and from there they began a systematic process of conquest and consolidation that would last nearly 2 centuries. What made the Teutonic Knights truly formidable was not just their military skill, though they possessed that in abundance. It was their organizational structure. The order was ruled by a Grand Master, an elected leader who commanded absolute authority. Below him was a rigid hierarchy of knights, sergeants, and soldiers, all trained from youth to fight with precision and discipline. The training of a Teutonic knight was extraordinarily rigorous. Young nobles entered the order and underwent military education that rivaled any in Europe. They learned cavalry tactics, siege warfare, and the use of every weapon known to medieval warfare. They were taught Latin, strategy, and the principles of command. They learned religious devotion combined with martial excellence. By the early 15th century, the Teutonic Order controlled a vast territory stretching from modern-day Poland into the Baltic regions. They had built a network of fortresses, each one a masterpiece of medieval military architecture. They possessed a navy on the Baltic Sea. They maintained diplomatic relations with other European powers. They were wealthy, organized, and seemingly unassailable. The knights had defeated every enemy they had faced. They had crushed pagan uprisings in Lithuania. They had repelled Russian invasions from the east. They had fought against Polish kings and emerged victorious. In the centuries since their arrival in the Baltic, no force had successfully challenged their dominance. This military invincibility bred a particular kind of arrogance. The Teutonic Knights believed themselves superior not just militarily, but morally. They were crusaders fighting for Christendom against paganism and barbarism. They saw themselves as the defenders of civilization itself. Their enemies were not merely military opponents but infidels, savages, and heretics. This ideological certainty was reinforced by military success. Victory after victory seemed to confirm the righteousness of their cause. Enemy armies broke before them. Fortresses fell to their siege weapons. Their tactics, refined over nearly 2 centuries of warfare, seemed perfected and immutable. By 1410, the Grand Master of the Teutonic Order was Ulrich von Jungingen. He was a warrior of considerable reputation, a leader who embodied the values of the order. He had fought in numerous campaigns. He had defeated enemies across the Baltic. He represented the peak of Teutonic power and confidence. What von Jungingen did not realize in 1410 was that he was about to face an enemy unlike any the Teutonic Knights had previously encountered. This enemy was not a disorganized pagan confederation or a feudal kingdom torn by internal conflict. This enemy was a unified Polish-Lithuanian alliance led by men who had studied Teutonic methods and devised strategies to counter them. More importantly, this enemy understood something fundamental. The Teutonic Knights, for all their military prowess, had a critical vulnerability. They relied on cavalry charges, on the weight of armored knights crashing into enemy formations. They depended on disciplined close-quarters combat. They assumed that their superior training and equipment would overwhelm any opposition. This was precisely what made them vulnerable to a different kind of warfare, a different kind of tactic, a shocking innovation that would catch the Teutonic Knights completely off guard. In early 1410, as tensions between the Teutonic Order and the Polish-Lithuanian alliance escalated, the fate of Eastern Europe hung in the balance. Two powers, each believing themselves invincible, were about to collide. And the world would never be the same. To understand how the Teutonic Knights could be defeated, one must first understand the power that rose to challenge them, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. This was not a simple medieval kingdom. It was a complex political entity formed through alliance, diplomacy, and the marriage of two royal families. Poland, by the early 15th century, was a substantial kingdom in Central Europe. It controlled rich agricultural lands along the Vistula River. It possessed a growing merchant class and accumulating wealth. Its kings had proven themselves capable military leaders. But Poland alone was not strong enough to definitively challenge the Teutonic Order. Lithuania, however, represented something different. The Grand Duchy of Lithuania was a vast territory stretching from the Baltic south into what is now Ukraine and Belarus. It was sparsely populated but immensely large, with considerable natural resources and military potential. The union of Poland and Lithuania created a superpower. When the Polish king Władysław II Jagiello married the Lithuanian Grand Duchess Jadwiga, political alliance became dynastic reality. The two kingdoms remained legally separate but coordinated their policies and military efforts. By 1410, this alliance had matured and strengthened. The rulers understood that the Teutonic Order represented an existential threat to their independence. The Knights controlled the Baltic coast. They threatened Polish trade and territorial integrity. They represented a permanent military threat on the northern frontier. The man who led the Polish-Lithuanian forces against the Teutonic Knights was not a professional soldier, though he was a capable military commander. His name was Władysław II, and he was a political genius as much as a military tactician. He understood that defeating the Teutonic Knights required more than simply fielding a large army. It required strategy, preparation, and understanding the nature of Teutonic military dominance. Alongside the Władysław stood Vytautas, the Grand Duke of Lithuania. Vytautas was himself a legendary warrior, a man who had fought across Eastern Europe and acquired vast military experience. Together, the Władysław and Vytautas represented a formidable military and political partnership. The alliance between Poland and Lithuania was not merely a matter of military convenience. It represented a fundamental shift in Eastern European geopolitics. Two previously competing powers had united against a common enemy. This unity gave them advantages that neither possessed individually. The Polish-Lithuanian army that mobilized in 1410 was composed of different types of soldiers than the Teutonic Order fielded. The core of the Polish army was the szlachta, the Polish nobility and their retainers. These were experienced cavalry warriors, but they were organized differently than the Teutonic Knights. They were feudal levies, bound to their king and to each other by ties of loyalty and obligation rather than by monastic vows. The Lithuanian forces were even more diverse. They included cavalry warriors, light infantry, and archers. Many Lithuanian soldiers came from regions that had only recently converted to Christianity, their pagan military traditions still fresh in living memory. They fought with different tactics than Western European knights, relying on mobility, archery, and unconventional warfare. Supporting both Polish and Lithuanian forces were contingents from Allied powers and mercenaries hired for the campaign. There were Czechs, Moldavians, and volunteers from other Allied territories. What made this diverse array of forces formidable was unity of command and a clear strategic objective. The Ladislaw and Vytautas had planned this campaign carefully. They had assembled their forces specifically to confront the Teutonic Knights. They understood what they were attempting and why it mattered. Most crucially, the Polish-Lithuanian leadership understood Teutonic tactics. They knew that the Knights relied on heavy cavalry charges. They knew that Teutonic military formations were designed for head-on confrontation. And crucially, they had devised a strategy to exploit these strengths and turn them into vulnerabilities. By early July 1410, the Polish-Lithuanian army had mobilized completely and was moving toward the Teutonic heartland. The Teutonic Order, receiving reports of this mobilization, prepared for battle. Grand Master von Jungingen mobilized the full military power of the order, calling in forces from across Teutonic-controlled territories. The stage was set for a confrontation that would determine the future of Eastern Europe. Neither side understood fully what they were about to face. In the summer of 1410, two great armies were on the move. The Polish-Lithuanian force, numbering perhaps 30,000 to 40,000 warriors, advanced northward toward Teutonic territory. The exact numbers are unclear, as medieval chroniclers often exaggerated troop strengths, but by any measure, it was a formidable force. The Teutonic Order, receiving intelligence of this mobilization, understood that a decisive confrontation was approaching. Grand Master Ulrich von Jungingen mobilized every available resource. Knights from across Teutonic territories were called to muster. Garrisons were emptied. Fortresses were left with minimal defense. The entire military might of the order was concentrated for a single, decisive battle. The Teutonic force that assembled was smaller than the Polish-Lithuanian army, perhaps numbering 20,000 to 25,000 warriors. But these were not ordinary soldiers. These were the elite of European medieval warfare. These were knights who had trained since childhood. These were warriors whose reputation for invincibility had been built over nearly 2 centuries of unbroken success. Grand Master von Jungingen was confident. He believed that in open battle, Teutonic discipline and training would overcome numerical disadvantage. The knights had defeated larger armies before. They had shattered pagan confederations and feudal levies with ease. Why should this confrontation be different? Von Jungingen established his battle camp near the village of Grunwald, in the region of Prussia. He positioned his forces on terrain that he believed was advantageous for cavalry operations. He established supply lines and fortified his position. He waited for the enemy to arrive. The Polish-Lithuanian forces, meanwhile, advanced methodically toward Grunwald. They were not rushing. They were not panicking. They were moving with deliberate purpose, allowing supplies to catch up, ensuring that all forces remained cohesive and well-organized. The Ladislaw and Vytautas understood that they could not afford a defeat. A loss against the Teutonic Knights would be catastrophic. It would shatter Polish-Lithuanian unity. It would discredit their leadership. The Teutonic Order would remain dominant for centuries more. But more importantly, the Ladislaw and Vytautas understood something about the Teutonic Knights that von Jungingen did not. They understood that Teutonic military superiority, while real, was not absolute. It was based on specific tactics, specific formations, and specific assumptions about how medieval warfare was conducted. The Polish-Lithuanian leaders had identified a critical vulnerability in Teutonic tactics. The Teutonic Knights depended on the charge. They depended on the weight of heavy cavalry crashing into enemy formations. They depended on close-quarters combat where their superior training and discipline would overwhelm opposition. But what if an enemy did not engage in close-quarters combat? What if an enemy avoided the charge? What if an enemy used tactics that negated the advantages of heavy cavalry? This was precisely what the Ladislaus and Vytautas had planned. They had devised a strategy that would turn Teutonic strengths into weaknesses. They had prepared tactics that would exploit the very assumptions that made the knights confident. On July 14, 1410, the two armies made contact. Reconnaissance forces clashed. Both sides realized that the moment of decision had arrived. Von Jungingen prepared for battle the next day. The Ladislaus and Vytautas confirmed their strategy and prepared their forces. Neither commander fully understood what was about to happen. Both believed they would win. Both believed they had prepared adequately for the confrontation. Both believed that victory was their destiny. But one of them was about to experience something unprecedented. One of them was about to face a tactical innovation that would shatter his assumptions about medieval warfare. One of them was about to suffer not merely a military defeat, but a historical catastrophe. On the morning of July 15, 1410, the Battle of Grunwald began. And nothing would ever be the same. The battle began in the early morning on July 15, 1410. The Teutonic Knights, confident and prepared, advanced toward the Polish-Lithuanian position. They expected the enemy to engage in conventional medieval cavalry combat. They expected to demonstrate their superior training through overwhelming force. What they encountered instead was something entirely different. As the Teutonic Knights advanced, they found themselves facing not a densely packed formation of cavalry, but a more dispersed arrangement of soldiers. The Polish-Lithuanian forces had deliberately positioned their cavalry and infantry in a way that presented multiple, scattered targets rather than a single focal point for attack. More shockingly, as the Teutonic cavalry charged, they encountered volleys of arrows unlike anything they had previously faced. The Polish-Lithuanian forces had positioned large contingents of archers who unleashed coordinated barrages of arrows at the advancing knights. These were not the disorganized arrows of medieval militia. These were carefully coordinated volleys designed to maximize casualties and disrupt Teutonic formations. The psychological impact was profound. Teutonic knights, accustomed to shattering enemy formations through direct cavalry charges, found themselves under sustained archery fire from multiple directions. Horses panicked and stumbled. Knights fell from their mounts, pierced by arrows. The neat formations that had been drilled into perfection became chaotic and fragmented. But this was only the beginning of the shocking tactic that would end Teutonic dominance. As the Teutonic cavalry pressed forward despite the arrows, they found that the Polish-Lithuanian forces did not stand and fight in the manner of previous enemies. Instead, the Lithuanian cavalry, lighter and more mobile than the heavy Teutonic knights, engaged in a series of tactical maneuvers designed to disrupt and harass rather than to directly confront. The Lithuanians would charge the Teutonic flank, strike, and withdraw. They would engage in a style of warfare that was almost impossible for the heavy cavalry to respond to effectively. The Teutonic knights were trained for direct confrontation, for the crushing weight of cavalry impact. They were not trained for the cat-and-mouse tactics that the Lithuanians now employed. What made this tactic truly shocking was not any single element, but the coordinated combination of all of them. Coordinated archery to disrupt formations. Mobile cavalry to harass and outmaneuver. Infantry positioned to exploit breakthroughs. Reserve forces held back and committed at critical moments. Grand Master von Jungingen himself understood that something unprecedented was happening. He attempted to reorganize his forces, to establish new formations, to respond to this unconventional warfare. But every attempt to regroup was met with new volleys of arrows, new cavalry charges, new attacks from unexpected directions. The Teutonic Knights, trained for 2 centuries in conventional medieval warfare, found themselves unable to adapt to this new style of combat. Their training, their discipline, their confidence, all of these, which had been their greatest strengths, now became partially neutralized by an enemy that refused to fight according to medieval conventions. As the battle progressed through the morning, the situation became increasingly desperate for the Teutonic Order. Their formations were fragmented. Their cavalry charges, once considered almost unstoppable, were being disrupted before they could reach their objectives. Their archers, though skilled, were being overwhelmed by the sheer volume of Polish-Lithuanian arrows. Most critically, the Teutonic Knights began to experience something they had never experienced before: sustained casualties without achieving proportional damage to the enemy. They were losing warriors at a rate they had not anticipated. Their losses were mounting. Their formations were becoming thinner. By late morning, the psychological collapse had begun. Teutonic soldiers who had never known defeat were beginning to understand that they might actually lose this battle. This realization, spreading through the ranks, had a cascading effect on morale and effectiveness. What had begun as a battle that von Jungingen was confident he would win was transforming into a catastrophe. The shocking tactic that the Polish-Lithuanian alliance had devised had completely negated Teutonic military superiority. The myth of Teutonic invincibility, built over nearly 2 centuries, was collapsing in real time. By midday on July 15th, the Battle of Grunwald was no longer a contest. It was a catastrophe for the Teutonic Order. The carefully constructed formations that Grand Master von Jungingen had organized were collapsing under sustained assault from multiple directions. The shocking tactic continued to evolve as the battle progressed. The Polish forces, seeing that their strategy was succeeding, doubled down on coordinated archery and cavalry harassment. Volleys of arrows darkened the sky. Polish cavalry charged at moments when Teutonic formations were at their weakest. Infantry advanced to exploit breaches in the German lines. The Teutonic Knights fought with bravery that was almost beyond comprehension. These were trained warriors, elite soldiers who had dedicated their lives to military excellence. Even as it became clear that defeat was approaching, they maintained formation and fought with courage and discipline. But courage and discipline, however admirable, could not overcome the fundamental reality. They were being defeated by a superior tactical strategy. Grand Master von Jungingen fought on the battlefield itself, which was itself unprecedented. Teutonic Grand Masters typically commanded from rear positions, away from direct combat. But von Jungingen understood the desperation of the situation. He moved to the front lines to inspire his troops and attempt to rally them. It was a brave gesture. It was also fatal. In the chaos of battle, von Jungingen was struck down. The Grand Master of the Teutonic Order, the symbol of Teutonic power and authority, fell mortally wounded. Other high-ranking Teutonic commanders fell alongside him. The leadership structure of the order was collapsing even as the military structure disintegrated around them. As the afternoon wore on, the Teutonic forces began to fragment completely. Some units attempted to maintain formation and fight to the death. Others attempted to withdraw from the battlefield. Still others simply fled in panic, abandoning their armor and weapons in their desperate attempts to escape. The Polish-Lithuanian forces, sensing victory, pressed their advantage. They pursued retreating Teutonic warriors. They consolidated their positions and launched new attacks on remaining pockets of Teutonic resistance. By the early evening, it was clear to everyone that the Battle of Grunwald was a complete and utter disaster for the Teutonic Order. The casualty figures were staggering. Estimates suggest that between 8,000 and 12,000 Teutonic warriors died in the battle. Considering that the Teutonic force numbered only 20 to 25,000, this represented a casualty rate of roughly 40 to 50%. The Polish-Lithuanian casualties, while significant, were considerably lower, perhaps 3,000 to 4,000 warriors. But beyond the immediate casualty count, the psychological impact was even more devastating. The myth of Teutonic invincibility had been shattered. An army that had never been decisively defeated had been crushed by a Polish-Lithuanian alliance using tactics that negated every advantage the knights possessed. Surviving Teutonic warriors retreated to their fortresses, traumatized and demoralized. The news of the disaster spread rapidly throughout Europe. In capitals from Rome to Constantinople to England, the news arrived: the Teutonic knights had been defeated. Their dominance had ended. Their seemingly eternal empire had been broken. The shocking tactic that the Ladislaw and Vytautas had devised had proven devastatingly effective. By refusing to engage in the kind of direct cavalry combat that the Teutonic knights expected, by utilizing coordinated archery and mobile cavalry tactics, they had discovered the vulnerability in Teutonic military doctrine. What the Polish-Lithuanian leaders had learned through study and preparation, the Teutonic knights had learned through bitter experience. The age of their dominance was over. The world had changed. Medieval warfare had evolved beyond the tactics that had made them supreme. The Battle of Grunwald was not merely a military defeat. It was a historical turning point. It was the moment when Eastern European history shifted direction. It was the beginning of the end for the Teutonic Order. In the days following the Battle of Grunwald, messengers carried news of the disaster to every Teutonic fortress in Prussia. The Grand Master was dead. The army was decimated. The order had suffered a crushing defeat. For the first time in nearly 2 centuries, the Teutonic knights faced not triumph but catastrophe. Grand Master Ulrich von Jungingen's successor, Heinrich von Plauen, took command of the order in the aftermath of Grunwald. Von Plauen was a capable military leader, but he inherited an impossible situation. The Teutonic Order's military dominance had been broken. Its soldiers were demoralized. Its reputation for invincibility had been destroyed. Most critically, the political consequences of Grunwald quickly became apparent. The Polish-Lithuanian alliance, victorious and emboldened, pressed their advantage. They launched multiple military campaigns against the Teutonic territories. They captured fortresses and cities. They advanced the borders of Polish-Lithuanian territory at Teutonic expense. The Teutonic Order attempted to recover, but they never regained their previous dominance. New battles were fought, but the outcome remained the same. The Teutonic knights could no longer decisively defeat their Polish-Lithuanian enemies. The military balance of power in Eastern Europe had fundamentally shifted. The consequences extended beyond merely military considerations. The economic impact of Grunwald was severe. The Teutonic Order had relied on territorial expansion and the tribute paid by subject populations to fund their military activities. With expansion ended and territories lost, the financial base that supported the order began to erode. More fundamentally, the ideological impact of Grunwald was catastrophic. The Teutonic Knights had presented themselves as crusaders fighting for Christendom against paganism and barbarism. Their military invincibility had seemed to validate this ideology. If they were invincible, the logic went, it was because God favored their cause. But defeat contradicted this narrative. If God favored the Teutonic cause, how could they be so completely defeated by Polish-Lithuanian forces? How could tactics alone account for such a complete military collapse? The certainty that had characterized the order's ideology began to fracture. In 1410 and 1411, the Peace of Thorn was negotiated between the Teutonic Order and the Polish-Lithuanian alliance. The treaty recognized Polish territorial gains and essentially acknowledged Teutonic military defeat. The order retained its territories, but it had lost the initiative, the momentum, and the undisputed military dominance that had characterized the previous 2 centuries. Over the following decades, the Teutonic Order continued to decline. It was not immediately destroyed. The order would persist for another century, but its role as a dominant power had ended. It became a secondary power in Eastern European politics, increasingly marginalized and eventually eliminated as a political entity. By the early 16th century, the Teutonic Order was in terminal decline. In 1525, the last Grand Master secularized the order and converted Prussia into a secular ducal state. The order itself was dissolved. What had once seemed an eternal empire, a permanent fixture in Eastern Europe, was gone. The shocking tactic that had been deployed at Grunwald had not merely won a single battle. It had ended the Teutonic Order as a major power in European history. It had transformed Eastern European geopolitics. It had demonstrated that even seemingly invincible military organizations could be defeated through superior tactics and coordinated strategy. For the Polish-Lithuanian alliance, Grunwald was the beginning of an era of expansion and power. Poland-Lithuania would become one of the great powers of Eastern Europe, rivaling the Ottoman Empire and the Russian principalities in influence and territorial extent. The shocking tactic had changed history. To truly understand the significance of Grunwald, one must understand why the shocking tactic employed by the Ladislaw and Vytautas was so devastatingly effective against an opponent that had dominated for nearly 2 centuries. The Teutonic Knights had built their military system around the heavily armored cavalry charge. A knight in full plate armor, mounted on a war horse, moving at a gallop and wielding a lance was one of the most formidable combat units of the medieval world. The weight, the speed, the training all combined to create a weapon system that was nearly unstoppable when employed correctly. The Teutonic Order had refined this system over 2 centuries. Every Teutonic knight trained relentlessly in cavalry tactics. Knights practiced the charge thousands of times, until it became almost instinctive. They trained their horses. They practiced lance work. They drilled in formation. The result was a military machine optimized for the cavalry charge. This optimization had worked brilliantly for nearly 200 years. Every enemy the Teutonic Knights faced relied on essentially the same tactical framework as the knights themselves. Pagan confederations fought with lighter cavalry and infantry. Polish feudal armies fought with similar cavalry formations. Even Russian forces, with their different tactical traditions, ultimately relied on cavalry and close-quarters combat. Against all of these enemies, the Teutonic advantage was decisive. Superior armor, superior training, superior discipline. These advantages created an essentially insurmountable gap in combat effectiveness. But the Ladislaw and Vytautas understood something critical. This tactical system had a vulnerability. It was optimized for a specific type of warfare. It assumed that the enemy would engage in direct cavalry combat. It assumed that the battlefield would be relatively open, allowing for cavalry maneuvers. It assumed that the enemy would seek direct confrontation. What if all of these assumptions were violated? The shocking tactic was based on this insight. Instead of engaging in the direct cavalry combat that the Teutonic Knights expected, the Polish-Lithuanian forces employed a coordinated combination of archery, mobile cavalry tactics, and infantry support. The coordinated archery was crucial. Medieval archers, while capable of delivering significant damage, had never been coordinated effectively enough to disrupt heavy cavalry formations. The Polish-Lithuanian forces changed this. They positioned their archers carefully and coordinated their volleys to maximize disruption to Teutonic formations. Arrows falling on armored cavalry do not always kill immediately. But they do several things. They panic horses, they disrupt formations, and they psychologically affect soldiers who are accustomed to being nearly invulnerable. Teutonic knights, trained to expect close-quarters combat, were not psychologically prepared for being struck by arrows from a distance where they could not retaliate effectively. The mobile cavalry tactics were equally important. The Polish-Lithuanian cavalry, lighter and less armored than the Teutonic Knights, could not match them in a head-to-head cavalry engagement. But they could harry the flanks, disrupt formations, and engage in tactics that forced the Teutonic Knights to respond in ways that played to Polish-Lithuanian strengths rather than Teutonic ones. The infantry support provided additional pressure, attacking when Teutonic formations were disrupted or disorganized. The fundamental insight was this: the Teutonic Knights were masters of one specific type of warfare, the heavy cavalry charge in relatively open terrain. By denying them the conditions necessary for this type of warfare, by forcing them to operate in an environment where their training and equipment provided less advantage, the Polish-Lithuanian forces turned Teutonic strengths into vulnerabilities. This was perhaps the most significant innovation demonstrated at Grunwald, the understanding that no military system is invincible if its assumptions can be violated. The Teutonic Order had built nearly 2 centuries of military dominance on specific tactical and strategic assumptions. By understanding these assumptions and deliberately violating them, the Ladislaw and Vytautas had discovered a way to defeat the seemingly undefeatable. This lesson would echo through military history. Tactics that dominate one era can become vulnerable in the next era if an opponent discovers how to violate the fundamental assumptions upon which those tactics are based. The Teutonic Knights learned this lesson at Grunwald, and the cost of that lesson was their dominance in Eastern Europe. Following the Battle of Grunwald, the Teutonic Order never recovered its previous dominance. The years and decades that followed saw a steady erosion of Teutonic power and territory. The immediate military consequences were significant. The Teutonic Order had depended on territorial expansion to generate revenue and maintain its military power. Grunwald ended expansion. More than that, it initiated contraction. The Polish-Lithuanian alliance captured Teutonic territories. Former Teutonic vassals rebelled against Order authority. The 13 Years' War, which broke out in 1454, represented the final catastrophe for the Teutonic Order as a political entity. During this conflict, the Order was effectively destroyed as an independent power. Prussia was divided. The western portions came under Polish-Lithuanian control. The eastern portions were eventually converted into a secular ducal state that existed in loose dependence to Poland. By the early 16th century, the Order had been completely secularized. The last Grand Master renounced the Order and established Prussia as a secular state. The religious military order that had ruled Eastern Europe for nearly 200 years was gone. The decline was not instantaneous. The order took decades to completely collapse. But the trajectory was clear from 1410 onward. Grunwald had broken something essential in the Teutonic Order. It had broken the myth of invincibility. It had demonstrated that alternatives to Teutonic military methods existed and could be effective. More importantly, Grunwald had shifted the balance of power in Eastern Europe. Before 1410, the Teutonic Order had been the dominant military power in the region, and other powers had had to accommodate to this reality. After 1410, the Polish-Lithuanian alliance was the dominant power, and the Teutonic Order was in decline. This shift had geopolitical consequences that extended across centuries. A Europe dominated by an Eastern German military order would have developed very differently from a Europe where Polish-Lithuanian power was ascendant. The religious character of the region might have been different. The political alignments might have been different. The eventual rise of the Russian Empire might have followed a different trajectory. But because of Grunwald, because of the shocking tactic that ended Teutonic dominance, a different future emerged. A future in which Eastern Europe was shaped by Slavic powers rather than Germanic military orders. A future in which Polish-Lithuanian civilization became the dominant force in the region. The Teutonic Knights themselves survived for over a century after Grunwald, but they were shadows of their former selves. They were reduced to a minor order of minor significance. They could no longer shape regional geopolitics. They could no longer threaten neighboring states. They could no longer expand their territory through military conquest. What had once seemed eternal had collapsed in the span of a single day of battle. Grunwald represented something more than merely a military defeat. It represented a revolution in medieval military tactics. The shocking tactic deployed by the Ladislaw and Vytautas demonstrated a new way of thinking about warfare. Prior to Grunwald, medieval warfare had been characterized by heavy cavalry dominance. The armored knight on horseback was considered the ultimate weapon system. Infantry was considered subordinate. Archers were considered auxiliary forces to be deployed in support of cavalry. The logical conclusion of this thinking was that armies were merely collections of cavalry units, with other soldiers serving in support roles. Grunwald challenged this entire framework. It demonstrated that if cavalry could be disrupted, harassed, and prevented from conducting effective charges, then infantry and archers could dominate the battlefield. It demonstrated that coordinated missile fire, archery delivered in controlled volleys, could be devastating against cavalry that was not properly protected or positioned. This lesson was quickly learned by military theorists and commanders throughout Europe. In the decades and centuries following Grunwald, we see the steady rise of pike-armed infantry as a counter to cavalry. We see the increasing professionalization and coordination of archery units. We see the beginning of the end of medieval heavy cavalry dominance. The Spanish tercio formations of the 16th century, which combined pike-armed infantry with musketeers and archery, were direct descendants of the insights demonstrated at Grunwald. The Swiss pike squares that dominated European battlefields in the 15th and 16th centuries similarly represented a response to the understanding that coordinated infantry could defeat heavy cavalry if properly trained and positioned. Grunwald was not the only factor in this transition. There were other battles and other innovations, but it was certainly one of the most significant. It provided a clear demonstration that the heavy cavalry charge, which had dominated European warfare for centuries, could be negated through superior tactics. For military history, Grunwald represents a turning point. It marks the transition from the age of cavalry dominance to the age of coordinated combined arms warfare. It demonstrates the principle that no military system remains dominant forever if an opponent discovers how to neutralize its strengths. More broadly, Grunwald demonstrates a principle that extends beyond merely military considerations. It shows that traditional systems of power can be vulnerable to well-executed challenges. The assumption that because something has worked for a long time, it will continue to work forever is a dangerous one. Systems that have been successful often become complacent and rigid, making them vulnerable to innovators who approach the problem from a different perspective. The Teutonic Knights had been successful for so long that they had become locked into a particular way of thinking about warfare. They assumed that the cavalry charge, refined over centuries, was the ultimate expression of military force. They assumed that armor, training, and discipline would always overcome opposition. They assumed that their enemies would continue to fight according to medieval conventions. The Ladislaw and Vytautas violated all of these assumptions. They approached the problem of defeating the Teutonic Knights not by attempting to beat them at their own game, which would have been impossible, but by refusing to play that game at all. They changed the rules of warfare, and in doing so, they changed history. This lesson has resonance even in the modern world. It suggests that entrenched powers, no matter how successful, the significance of Grunwald extended far beyond Eastern Europe. News of the Teutonic defeat spread rapidly throughout Europe. In every court and every center of learning, military strategists and rulers grappled with the implications. For Western European powers, Grunwald suggested that the era of crusading military orders as dominant forces was coming to an end. The Teutonic Knights had been the last of the great crusading orders, and their defeat signaled that this phase of European military history was concluding. For Eastern European powers, Grunwald demonstrated that they could challenge and defeat Western European military forces. For centuries, Eastern Europe had been on the defensive against Western European invasions and domination. Grunwald reversed this dynamic. It showed that Polish-Lithuanian forces could not merely resist Western aggression, but could actually defeat Western military powers decisively. This psychological shift was profound. Eastern European rulers who had previously assumed they could not match Western European military technology or training now understood that with proper tactics and strategy, victory was possible. This understanding would shape Eastern European military development for centuries to come. For the broader development of European military technology and tactics, Grunwald was transformative. The battle demonstrated that mounted heavy cavalry, which had been the dominant military force in Europe for centuries, could be defeated. This understanding accelerated the development of pike-armed infantry formations, which would dominate European battlefields in the 16th century. The rise of professional standing armies in the 15th and 16th centuries can be partially traced to the lessons of Grunwald. If cavalry could be defeated, then military forces needed to be reorganized around different principles. This reorganization ultimately led to the development of the modern military formations that would characterize European warfare from the 16th century onward. Grunwald also had implications for military engineering and fortification design. The Teutonic Order had relied partially on its network of fortresses to project power. But if the main field army could be defeated, fortresses became less critical. This understanding contributed to changes in how military engineers designed fortifications in the 15th century and beyond. Perhaps most importantly, Grunwald demonstrated a principle that would be validated repeatedly throughout military history. That innovation, when combined with understanding of an opponent's weaknesses, can overcome traditional military superiority. This principle would manifest repeatedly in European history, from the development of early firearms overcoming pike formations, to the development of armor-piercing shells overcoming armored fortifications, to the development of air power overcoming traditional land defenses. In each case, the fundamental dynamic was the same as at Grunwald. An established military system, successful for a long period, was overcome by an innovator who understood the system's vulnerabilities and developed tactics to exploit them. For Poland and Lithuania specifically, Grunwald was the foundation of their rise to major power status. The victory unified Polish-Lithuanian forces around a sense of shared triumph. It validated the Ladislaw and Vytautas as military and political leaders of exceptional capability. It opened territories and resources that had previously been controlled by the Teutonic Order. In the century and a half following Grunwald, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth would become one of the great powers of Europe. At its peak in the 17th century, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth would be one of the largest and most powerful states in Europe, rivaling the Ottoman Empire and the Russian Empire in territorial extent and military power. None of this would have been possible without Grunwald. The victory at Grunwald was the beginning of the transformation that would make Poland-Lithuania a European superpower. It was the moment when Eastern European power shifted from the Teutonic Order to the Polish-Lithuanian alliance. 700 years have passed since the Battle of Grunwald. The Teutonic Order is long gone. The Teutonic state of Prussia was absorbed into larger German and Russian states. The medieval world that produced both the Teutonic Knights and the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth has disappeared. Yet Grunwald remains one of the most studied battles in military history. Military academies throughout the world teach Grunwald as a masterclass in tactical innovation. Strategic theorists cite Grunwald as a demonstration of fundamental principles about power and how it can be challenged. The lessons of Grunwald are multiple and profound. First, it demonstrates that military superiority based on specific tactical systems can be neutralized if an opponent understands the system's vulnerabilities and develops appropriate counter-tactics. The Teutonic Knights were superior in cavalry, armor, and training. But when the Polish-Lithuanian forces refused to engage in the type of cavalry combat at which the Teutonic Knights excelled, that superiority became irrelevant. Second, Grunwald demonstrates the importance of understanding your opponent. The Ladislaw and Vytautas succeeded because they had studied the Teutonic Knights. They understood how the knights fought. They understood the assumptions that underlay Teutonic military doctrine. This understanding allowed them to develop tactics that would prove effective. Third, Grunwald demonstrates that innovation and adaptation are crucial in competitive environments. The Polish-Lithuanian forces employed tactics that were unusual for the medieval period. They coordinated archery in ways that had not previously been done systematically. They employed cavalry in unconventional ways, focusing on harassment and disruption rather than frontal assault. This willingness to innovate proved decisive. Fourth, Grunwald demonstrates that entrenched powers can become vulnerable if they become too confident in their methods. The Teutonic Knights had been successful for so long that they had perhaps become overconfident. They assumed that their methods would continue to work. They did not adapt to changing circumstances. They did not innovate. This rigidity made them vulnerable. Fifth, Grunwald demonstrates that numerical disadvantage can be overcome through superior strategy. The forces were roughly equal in size, but the Polish-Lithuanian superiority came primarily from superior tactics and strategy rather than overwhelming numerical advantage. Perhaps most profoundly, Grunwald demonstrates that history is not predetermined. For nearly 200 years, it had seemed that the Teutonic Knights were the inevitable rulers of Eastern Europe. Their military dominance had seemed permanent and eternal. Yet a single day of battle changed this entire trajectory. The Ladislaw and Vytautas, through superior preparation and tactics, altered the course of history. This lesson applies beyond merely military considerations. Throughout history, entrenched powers have assumed their dominance was permanent. They have assumed that because they had been powerful for a long time, they would remain powerful. Grunwald suggests that this assumption is often wrong. Power, no matter how great, can be challenged and overcome if the challenger approaches the problem with creativity, intelligence, and preparation. For modern readers, Grunwald offers insights into competitive dynamics generally. In business, in politics, in technology, in any competitive environment, the principle demonstrated at Grunwald applies. Entrenched powers can be vulnerable if competitors approach the competition from a fundamentally different perspective. The Teutonic Knights attempted to defeat the Polish-Lithuanian alliance by playing their own game, heavy cavalry warfare. They failed because their game had been understood and countered. Had they been able to innovate, to adapt to new tactics, they might have survived. But they could not break free from their traditional ways of thinking about warfare. This remains the lesson of Grunwald for all competitive systems. The greatest vulnerability is often not a lack of resources or capability, but a rigidity of thinking that makes adaptation to changing circumstances impossible. Entrenched powers that cannot innovate are vulnerable to challengers who can. We have now come full circle. From the rise of the Teutonic Order as a crusading military force in the late medieval period, through nearly 2 centuries of military dominance, to the catastrophic defeat at Grunwald, to the slow decline that led ultimately to the dissolution of the order as an independent political entity. The story of Grunwald is not merely a story about a single battle or even about a single military order. It is a story about the nature of power itself. It is a story about how power that seems absolute can be challenged and overcome. It is a story about how innovation and understanding can defeat tradition and confidence. The Teutonic Knights were not weak. They were not poorly trained or poorly equipped. They were not outnumbered in any overwhelming way. By any measure, they remained one of the most formidable military forces in Europe even after Grunwald. Yet a single battle changed everything. This transformation happened because the Ladislaw and Vytautas understood something fundamental, that the Teutonic Knights, for all their military excellence, were not invincible. They were vulnerable to a carefully constructed challenge based on understanding their weaknesses. The Polish-Lithuanian leaders studied the Knights. They learned their tactics. They identified their vulnerabilities. And they devised a shocking tactic that exploited those vulnerabilities with devastating effectiveness. The shocking tactic that ended the Teutonic Knights forever was not a single innovation but a coordinated combination of innovations: coordinated archery, mobile cavalry tactics, and infantry support deployed together in a way that negated Teutonic strengths and magnified Teutonic weaknesses. This coordinated approach proved devastatingly effective. It demonstrated that even the most powerful and seemingly invincible military systems can be overcome through superior tactics and strategy. It showed that preparation, understanding, and innovation matter. It proved that David can defeat Goliath if he approaches the problem correctly. For the Teutonic Order, Grunwald represented a point of no return. They never recovered their previous dominance. They never regained the military and political initiative. The order persisted for another century, but it was an order in decline, losing territory, losing resources, losing influence, slowly fading from the stage of history. The final dissolution of the Teutonic Order came in 1525, when the last Grand Master secularized the order and converted Prussia into a secular ducal state. What had once seemed an eternal empire was gone. What had once seemed invincible had been defeated and dismantled. What had once ruled Eastern Europe had been reduced to nothing. For Poland and Lithuania, Grunwald was the beginning of an era of expansion and power. The victory validated their leadership. It unified their peoples around shared triumph. It opened territories and resources. It established Poland-Lithuania as a major European power. It fundamentally transformed Eastern European geopolitics. In the centuries following Grunwald, Poland-Lithuania would become one of the great powers of Europe. It would rival the Ottoman Empire and the Russian Empire. It would shape Eastern European history for centuries to come. It would produce some of Europe's greatest leaders and most important historical developments. Yet none of this was predetermined. Had Grunwald gone differently, had the shocking tactic failed, had the Polish-Lithuanian forces been defeated, the entire subsequent history of Eastern Europe would have been transformed. The Teutonic Order might have survived and remained dominant for another century or more. Eastern Europe might have been shaped by Germanic rather than Slavic powers. The entire trajectory of European history might have been altered. But because the Ladislaw and Vytautas approached the problem differently, because they understood their opponent's weaknesses, because they devised a shocking tactic that negated Teutonic strengths, history took a different path. This is the legacy of Grunwald. It demonstrates that the future is not predetermined, that entrenched powers can be challenged and overcome, that innovation and understanding matter, that a single day of battle, fought with courage and tactical excellence, can change the course of civilizations. The shocking tactic that ended the Teutonic Knights forever was not a miracle or a surprise victory. It was the result of careful study, strategic planning, and the courage to implement a fundamentally different approach to warfare. And in implementing this approach, the Ladislaw and Vytautas changed Eastern European history. They changed the course of European history. They proved that even the seemingly invincible could be stopped. This is the story of Grunwald. And this is why it remains, 700 years later, one of the most consequential battles in human history. It is a story about power, about vulnerability, about innovation, and about the eternal human capacity to overcome seemingly impossible odds. The story is ended, but the lessons endure.